Tonight's set of notes is about writing our Constitution. So far we've discussed the Articles of Confederation, our nation's first government, and we talked about the ways that the Articles of Confederation was really a disaster. The Articles created a very weak national or central government that didn't have the power to control the states. And things were not going real well for the new country. Foreign countries were pretty much doing what they wanted and kind of ignoring our national government. The states could pretty much tell the national government no. And Shays' Rebellion up in Massachusetts was kind of the final straw where the leaders of the new nation decided, we really better do something about this or our country's going to fall apart. So they decided to meet in Philadelphia initially to revise the Articles, but they end up creating a brand new constitution, and that's our focus for this set of notes. So there's two parts here, and there's going to be two response questions that I want you to get the question down and respond to. Part one is about creating Congress and some of the challenges that they had to address and compromises that they had to come up with in order to create Congress in this new system of government. So first off, a little background. The Constitutional Convention had 55 delegates from 12 states. You'll notice it's 12, not 13. Rhode Island was so concerned about state power being taken away that they decided not to participate once they realized what was happening. All of these delegates were white men and primarily wealthy, well-off property owners. A couple important ideas that influenced the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Separation of powers. This was the idea that powers should be split up into three branches of government: a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And checks and balances. They wanted to make sure that they gave each branch the ability to check or block the others in order to keep them balanced, to make sure that no one branch would get too powerful. Each of the state constitutions had these written into them, so it gave us a good model for how to add them into our new national government. As they were coming up with this new constitution, one of the biggest concerns, one of the biggest problems that they faced was the question of how should seats in Congress be given out. Under the Articles of Confederation, all the states were equal. They all had one vote. Well, the bigger states didn't like that. So the delegates from Virginia introduced what became known as the Virginia Plan. They suggested we should have two houses of Congress, and seats should be based on population. States that had a lot of people would therefore get more votes than states that only had a few people. To the bigger states, this made a lot of sense. We have more people, therefore we should get more of a say. As you can imagine, the smaller states weren't wild about this plan. They came back with the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan said, let's keep it similar to the Articles of Confederation. Let's have a one-house Congress, and each state will be equal. The same number of seats for every state, since every state is independent. Shouldn't matter how big you are. We're all 13 equal states, and therefore we should have the same say. This issue, this debate, nearly ripped the Constitutional Convention apart. At different points, both sides, big states and small states, threatened to scuttle the whole thing, right? And it didn't really look like we were going to come to an agreement, but we did. And it was such an important agreement that it has gotten the nickname the Great Compromise. Under the Great Compromise, Congress would have two houses. The House of Representatives would be based on population. So that made the big states happy, right? The more people you got, the more seats you got in the House of Representatives. So big states would get more say. Small states liked the Senate. In the Senate, every state would have equal say. Every state got 2 senators, no matter how big or how small. So that solved that problem. But the next big issue was, well, if we're going to base the House of Representatives on population, what about slavery? Should slaves be counted as part of the state's population? If they were, states that had a lot of slaves, like Virginia, would get more seats. They would get more power. States without slaves felt that this was wrong. They argued that slaves weren't free, they weren't treated like citizens, and so they shouldn't be counted. So here you have a disagreement between slave states and free states. And again, argument, back and forth, debate. The whole thing nearly falls apart. And the solution they come up with is the infamous 3/5 compromise. Effectively, what it settled on was that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person. So if you had, for example, 5,000 slaves in your state, 3,000 would be counted and added to the population. It would count for the state's population, for representation, and also for taxes. So in terms of creating Congress, they had 2 really big problems they had to come to a compromise with. How should states be represented, and should slaves count as part of that population? You get the Great Compromise, you get the 3/5 compromise. So your first response question here in part 1 has to do with the concept of separation of powers. Why do you think it was important for us to split power up into 3 branches of government? And give an example of something bad that might happen if we didn't split power up this way. And, should be realistic. Why is it important that we split power into 3 different branches? What's something bad that could happen if we didn't? Feel free to go ahead and pause the notes at this point, and take a minute to get the question down in your notes and respond in the text box provided. And when you're done responding, go ahead and hit play again. We're going to move on to part 2, creating the presidency. And there's another important issue that they need to settle here. One of the biggest problems with the Articles of Confederation was that there was no executive branch. And that was done on purpose. People were worried that if the president were too powerful, he would act like a king. Right? And they didn't want a strong, powerful, king-like person in charge of the country. But That led to some problems because without a president, without an executive branch, there was nobody to enforce the rules. So they decided in the new Constitution that they would create an executive branch who would be in charge of enforcing the rules. So they needed to figure out what would that look like. Questions they had to figure out. How long would the president serve? Should it be 2 years, 10 years, life? Could the president be reelected, or should it only be one term? Should there only be one president? Maybe there should be a committee with 2 or 3. Finally, what they settled on was we'd have one president. The president would serve for 4 years, and the president would be allowed to be reelected. So a big question they then had to settle was, well, who's going to get to pick the president? On one side, you had some delegates who argued the American people should directly elect the president. You just hold a national election, and whoever gets the most votes is the winner. Other people said that Congress should pick the president because the average American might not know enough about the candidates to make an informed choice. Right? You got to remember, this is the 1780s. There's no internet. There's no 24-hour news channels. So if you're a farmer in Georgia, how could you possibly know enough about the person from New York running for president in order to make an informed decision? They were worried about that. So some people said maybe Congress should pick. The solution was the Electoral College. They said the people will pick the president, but they won't pick the president directly. Instead, we'll use this indirect method called the Electoral College. The people will get to vote for electors, and the electors will be the ones who get the final say in who the president's going to be. Which is why today we see maps like this every time there's a presidential election. We see red states and blue states, and we see numbers on there that represent the number of electors that each state gets. So, response question for part 2. Why do you think some people argue that the Electoral College is undemocratic? Remember, we're talking about democratic. We're talking about the ability of the people to make decisions through voting, right? Electing their leaders. So if democracy means voting and electing your leaders, why do some people argue that the Electoral College is undemocratic? Make sure you write the response question in the box and type up your response. Print your notes before the start of the next class.